Wednesday, 22nd of January, 1879. KwaZulu, South Africa. The arid ground is littered with the dead and dying. The victorious pick over the bodies for anything valuable, but, even more horrifically, slitting open the stomachs of every single corpse they could find. This was the aftermath of the worst and most catastrophic defeat in British colonial history. Today, Descent into Darkness explores the tale of hubris and arrogance that led to the Battle of Isandlwana. Background. The long-reaching arms of the British Empire had established the Cape Colony in what is modern-day South Africa all the way back in 1795. By 1879, it had grown to encompass all the land up to the borders of the land owned by the Basotho of the west and the Zulu of the east. One event that upset everything in the region was the discovery of diamonds in the region of the Vaal River in 1867. The area had many Dutch-descended white settlers called the Boers. Up until now, they had been largely isolated, and they liked it that way, especially when it came to the indigenous African people, whom the Boers despised with a bitter hatred that would shock even the KKK. The news of the diamond discovery sent British prospectors flooding into the area, hoping to grab themselves a slice of the pie. Within only 5 years, the small town of Kimberley had grown to a population of 50,000. To protect these interests, the British annexed this part of the country in the 1870s. As a further subtle attempt at a power grab, the then Secretary of State for the Colonies, Henry Herbert, the 4th Earl of Carnarvon, approached representatives of both Boer states, the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State, with the idea of creating a federation, like he had done previously in Canada. The Boer leaders rejected the idea. He also knew that he would have to, at some point, deal with the highly aggressive and proud nation of Zululand. Carnarvon decided then to get someone else to do his dirty work for him, appointing Sir Bartle Frere as High Commissioner of Southern Africa, on the understanding that he would seek to impose the Confederation idea upon the region. His reward for doing so would be being made governor of the newly created Dominion, and therefore one of the most powerful men in the whole empire. Frere decided to tackle Zululand first, as they were the most dangerous obstacle to the plan, a perception no doubt born out of the perceived inferiority of the indigenous black Africans. Frere began to engineer a series of events and incidents that he knew the Zulu would react to, and therefore have an excuse to overblow the effects and put together the case for an invasion and subjugation of the Zulu. One of these was the conflict between the Zulu and their northern neighbours, the Swazi. Frere decided to take the side of the Swazi when the Zulu captured their chief, Umbelini. Frere also took issue with the Zulu ejecting Christian missionaries from their lands. Another incident was outlined in a letter that Frere wrote to Lord Carnarvon's successor, Sir Michael Hicks Beach. Mr. Smith, a surveyor in the Colonial Engineer Department, was on duty inspecting the road down to the Tugela, near Fort Buckingham, which had been made a few years ago by order of Sir Garnet Wolseley, and accompanied by Mr. Dayton, a trader resident at Fort Buckingham, went down to the ford across the Tugela. The stream was very low and ran under the Zulu bank, but they were on this side of it, and had not crossed, when they were surrounded by a body of 15 or 20 armed Zulus, made prisoners and taken off with their horses, which were on the Natal side of the river, and roughly treated and threatened for some time, though ultimately, at the instance of a headman who came up, they were released and allowed to depart. Then there was the case involving 3 sons of Zulu warlord Sihayo Kazongo, who had pursued one of Sihayo's wives, who had fled from her husband, carried her back, and put her to death, as Zulu law dictated. A week later, the same thing happened with another one of Sihayo's wives. Makes you wonder how much of a bastard he must have been. This was, naturally, painted as a deplorable act of savagery by Frere, because, of course, the British were a paragon of virtue. An official letter of complaint was sent to the Zulu king Cetshwayo Kampande, and he answered thusly. Cetshwayo is sorry to have acknowledged that the message brought by Umlungi is true, but he begs His Excellency will not take it in the light he sees the Natal government seemed to do. As what Sihayo's sons did, he can only attribute to a rash act of boys who, in the zeal of their father's house, did not think of what they were doing. Cetshwayo acknowledges that they deserved punishing, and he sends some of his Isandlwana ambassadors who will follow Umlungi with his words. Cetshwayo states that no acts of his subjects will make him quarrel with the fathers of the House of Shaka. In 1877, when the Transvaal was fully annexed into the Cape Colony, the Boers were outraged, but they felt rather pinned against the twin threats of the British and the Zulu. They hated the Zulu, and therefore feared that if they decided to fight the British, Cetshwayo would seize the opportunity and attack the Transvaal. Whilst the machinations against the Zulu were slowly building, Sir Theophilus Shepstone, the Secretary for Native Affairs in Natal, wrote in a letter to Lord Carnarvon, Cetshwayo is the secret hope of every petty independent chief hundreds of miles from him, who feels a desire that his colour shall prevail, and it will not be until this hope is destroyed that they will make up their minds to submit to the rule of civilization. Shepstone did attempt to broker a meeting between the Boers and the Zulu to resolve their disputes, but this achieved nothing. This angered Shepstone, who directed all of his blame for the failure onto the Zulu. Back home, it is interesting to note that the then Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, and his Tory government did not want war with the Zulu, as it was felt that there were much greater problems elsewhere in the empire that presented a much more imminent and dangerous threat that would require a great deal of men and resources to counter should they arise. However, the wheels were already in motion. Sir Bartle Frere had heard Shepstone's anger with the Zulu, and both men agreed that the powerful African kingdom posed a great threat to peace in the region, and therefore took the old Latin adage of Si vis pacem, para bellum. If you seek peace, prepare for war. In December 1878, Frere presented King Cetshwayo with a 13-point ultimatum, one which he knew would be rejected. A lot of the points were based around the earlier small border dispute events that Frere had used to his advantage in building against the Zulu. They were as follows. Point 1. Surrender of Sihayo's 3 sons and brother to be tried by the Natal courts. 2. Payment of a fine of 500 head of cattle for the outrages committed by the above and for Cetshwayo's delay in complying with the request of the Natal government for the surrender of the offenders. 3. Payment of 100 head of cattle for the offence committed against Messrs. Smith and Dayton. 4. Surrender of the Swazi chief Umbelini and others to be named hereafter to be tried by the Transvaal courts. 5. Observance of the Coronation Promises. 6. That the Zulu army be disbanded and the men allowed to go home. 7. That the Zulu military system be discontinued and other military regulations adopted, to be decided upon after consultation with the Great Council and British representatives. 8. That every man, when he comes to man's estate, shall be free to marry. 9. All missionaries and their converts who until 1877 lived in Zululand shall be allowed to return and reoccupy their stations. 10. All missionaries shall be allowed to teach, and any Zulu, if he chooses, shall be free to listen to their teaching. 11. A British agent shall be allowed to reside in Zululand, who will see that the above provisions are carried out. 12. All disputes in which a missionary or European is concerned shall be heard by the King in public and in presence of the resident. 13. No sentence of expulsion from Zululand shall be carried out until it has been approved by the resident. It should come as little surprise that the proud Zulu were not about to give in to such overwhelming demands. particularly when it came to their army. And so, when the expiry period of the ultimatum had elapsed on the 10th of January 1879, the invasion of KwaZulu was begun. Freer had deliberately delayed informing London of his intentions to avoid the possibility of his orders being countermanded. Therefore, he was operating completely without the authorization of the British government. He had better hope that things went well. Prelude to battle. The British invasion force was commanded by Lieutenant General Frederick Augustus Thesiger, the Lord Chelmsford, who was put in command of approximately 16,500 men. He decided to split this number into 3 columns that would invade and surround the Zulu kingdom before pressing on to the nominal capital of the lands, Ulundi, where Cetshwayo lived. Chelmsford commanded the 3rd column that would be the centre of the invasion. They crossed the Buffalo River at a small, insignificant point on the map, a missionary station called Rorke's Drift, on the 11th of January. Some supplies were left behind at the station as to not encumber the column too much. To guard it, 140 men of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th Regiment, known as the 2nd Warwickshire, later the South Wales Borderers, were left behind also. On the morning of the 22nd of January, the column was encamped 10 miles from Rorke's Drift at the foot of Isandlwana Hill. Lord Chelmsford decided to split his forces and took half of them to support a forward reconnaissance party, leaving the rest in charge of Colonel Henry Pullein. Little did Chelmsford know, but the entire Zulu army had completely outmanoeuvred him and now sat poised, ready to strike on the planned day of the 23rd. Only a short distance from the main British camp. Opposing forces. The Zulu warrior was a fearsome opponent, tough, strong, and ruthless. He was dressed very Spartanly, with a loincloth decorated with grass, and leg wrappings similarly decorated. Some would wear necklaces made from animal teeth to show their bravery. The commanders and esteemed veterans wore animal pelts as a sign of their high rank. He was armed with 2 spears, a long one called an assegai for throwing, and a short one called an iklwa for hand-to-hand combat. Some Zulu did carry a motley collection of firearms. They were very old, and the supply of ammunition was patchy at best. The Zulu, in general, did not believe in the use of firearms as they considered them a coward's weapon that allowed you to kill a brave warrior before he can attack you. But this belief was slowly superseded by the sheer pragmatism of opportunity. The more arms were acquired, the more widespread their use became. However, marksmanship was very poor, most likely due to the lack of ammunition with which to practice. For protection, he carried a large oval shield called an ishilunga, made from dried cowhide stretched over a wooden frame. The colour of the hide denoted his rank. Younger, less experienced warrior shields were mostly black, and the veterans were mostly white, with painted patterns on the shield denoting the regiment or impi to which they belonged. Regiments would be arranged by rank, which not only included battle experience, but whether they were married, which is a rite of passage for the Zulu people. There is widespread rumours that prior to battle, the Zulu would eat a type of mushroom known to have hallucinogenic qualities. Rather than the type that we in the West know as magic mushrooms, the active agent being psilocybin, this one contained a substance called muskimol, which activates the brain's aminobutyric acid, or GABA-A receptors. This causes feelings of euphoria, a lucid, dreamlike state of mind, synesthesia, and so-called out-of-body experiences. I have been unable to find a definitive source that says the Zulu took this substance, but these rumours are further accompanied by alleged reports from Zulu sources, although not cited, that the warriors reported seeing red devils as they fought. So make of that what you will. I would be very interested in reading further if anyone knows of a credible source for this. On the other side, the British soldier was a professional volunteer, dressed in a scarlet tunic and a bright white pith helmet, dark blue trousers, and black leather boots. He was armed with the modern Martini Henry Mark I rifle, introduced only 8 years earlier. It was a breech-loading, single-shot rifle that utilized a falling block action actuated by a lever under the buttstock. It had an effective range of around 400 to 500 yards, but could hit out to a maximum of 1,800 yards, though this is more wishful thinking rather than an actual benefit. The rifle had been further improved, creating the Mark II, which cured a few small teething problems, but most of the men at Isandlwana had yet to be supplied with the updated model. It fired the hefty .577 by 450 Boxer Henry cartridge, which could throw a 480-grain paper-patched lead bullet at 1,350 feet per second. A slow-moving bullet, but when it hit hard. It was capable of penetrating 8 inches of solid oak at 500 yards. However, in its early days, the cartridge itself was deeply flawed. Instead of the more modern drawn brass of modern ammunition, the Boxer Henry cartridge was made of thin rolled brass foil that was soldered together around the case head. This led to many imperfections in the side walls of the cartridge. On top of this was that during continuous fire, the extreme heat of the chamber could easily melt this solder holding the cartridge together, meaning that the extractor would tear off the case head, leaving the body of the cartridge still inside the chamber. This meant that if you didn't have a small knife on you to get it out, you were either forced to deploy the cleaning rod down the barrel and try to poke it out of the breech, or to try to grab the hot brass with your fingers. Either choice is a bad one when you've got a horde of screaming warriors bearing down upon you. This has long been blamed as a major factor in the defeat, but, contrary to this very popular belief, this defect of casehead tearing had been fixed prior to the time of the battle. However, one more extraction problem did remain. The cartridge was not fully supported in the chamber, relying on pressure expansion to fill the chamber and create a gas-tight seal, and this could, here and there, mean that the cartridge still occasionally stuck, although whole, inside the chamber. But this did not leave the red-coated soldier completely defenseless. He was further armed with a triangular-bladed bayonet of 21.5 inches in length, that could be slotted over the end of the muzzle and secured by turning a locking ring. It was nicknamed the Lunger, as it had no sharp edges, so it was for stabbing only. This gave him a very long reach of 6 feet, more than a match for the short Ikloa spears of his opponent. Order of battle. The Zulu forces comprised of a rough total of around 20,000 men. Around 3/4 of these would be engaged in the battle, and the rest were held in reserve. The Zulu had developed a well-coordinated battle tactic that they called the Buffalo. This took the form of 4 separate sections: the head, or sometimes called the chest, the horns, and the loins. The men of the head would charge at the enemy and engage them, inducing them to surge forward themselves to meet them, whilst the horns began to outflank and encircle them. Once the encirclement was complete, the horns would charge at the flanks and rear of the enemy, and finally, the loins would reinforce the centre. This tactic was very dangerous and very effective, and led to the Zulu nation becoming a very powerful enemy. The British, meanwhile, could only muster around 748 regular British infantry and a further 1,089 men of the Natal native contingent, Africans both of white and black heritage which fought for the British. This made for a combined total of 1,837 men. There were also an unknown number of civilians that dealt with things such as wagons, horses, and oxen, etc. All of these men were initially inside the main camp, known as a laager, which sat at the foot of Isandlwana mountain, which dominated the countryside. The standard tactic of the British soldiers was to form in a 2-rank tightly packed line and give fire in one of 3 ways: all at once, known as volley fire, by each rank in turn, or by platoon, which gave a constant rolling fire along the line, like a deadly Mexican wave. However, the impending battle would see a huge error that would lead to an absolute slaughter. The Battle of Isandlwana. The battle was begun at around 1100 hours, inadvertently earlier than the Zulu had planned, when a small British scouting and foraging party had been chased away by a small party of Zulu. They had run toward a nearby valley to seek shelter. When they crested the summit of the valley mouth, they saw to their horror the whole 20,000-strong Zulu army sat waiting in almost total silence. Immediately, with the element of surprise now gone, they all leapt to their feet and began to pursue the small British force. The scouting party now had to fight a hurried retreat back toward the British camp toward Colonel Pullein. When word reached the camp, Pullein wasted no time in ordering the men to arms and forming up, a command known as Stand To. Upon hearing the bugle call, the men quickly grabbed up their rifles and headed for the outer perimeter of the camp. From his vantage point, Pullein was only able to see around 2/3 of the attacking force. This obscured his view of the Zulu left horn. He deployed his men in an extended firing line, and further dispatched a messenger to Lord Chelmsford's reconnaissance detachment to tell him of the impending action. The Zulu army beat their shields, stamped their feet, and chanted as a way to intimidate their enemy. Then a cry went up to charge, which was repeated by all the warriors, who surged forward toward their foe. The British had opened fire and had continued a steady rate of fire for around an hour and 20 minutes, a devastating hail of fire that checked the Zulu centre charge, rifle barrels becoming far too hot to touch, the heat haze coming off them obscuring the view for precise aiming. The men kept up this fire despite their aching, bruised shoulders from the harsh recoil as the Martini Henrys did their work. A great myth of the time, not helped by Hollywood, has the British soldiers waiting until the enemy was around 100 yards away before shooting. This is completely wrong. Firing usually commenced at around 500 yards, with the officers calling out the range and the men adjusting the ladder rear sights of their rifles accordingly. This gave a great distance to cover for the Zulu before they were able to throw their long assegai spears before the final charge. A major problem that is often reported was the quartermaster not distributing the ammunition quickly enough, with desperate men gathered around the supply wagons clamouring for the next box. Each ammunition box lid was secured with a large screw that needed to be undone before the lid could be opened. The cartridges were further packaged in paper packets of 10 rounds apiece and tied with string, meaning that even more faffing about was needed to use them than when they were doled out to each man. There are reports of men grabbing the boxes and bashing them open with the butts of their rifles in a bid to get at the precious cartridges. It is likely that the quartermaster simply could not get the boxes open quickly enough, rather than any other reason, such as strictly rationing or requiring a chit signed by their officer, as has been variously posited down the years. Pullein had seen the situation becoming more and more desperate and had ordered the withdrawal back toward the main camp. Unfortunately, the men of Durnford's company, who had been engaged for the longest, had begun to fall back much quicker than the rest, exposing the British right flank to the previously unseen Zulu left horn, which sensed the slackening in the British firepower and charged forward. Modern analysis of the battlefield throws up a grave error. Pullein had ordered that the defensive line be held way too far out from the encampment, meaning that instead of the tightly packed lines of men, there was a gap between each man of between 6 to 8 feet, meaning that if one man fell, a gap of 12 to 16 feet had been created, allowing the Zulu to swarm in, the men on either side being quickly overwhelmed. Once the breakthrough was achieved, the Zulu flooded in, and the British line dissolved into a bloody chaos of bitter and furious hand-to-hand fighting. There was a solar eclipse that day at around 1430. An unnamed Zulu warrior said in his account of the battle, "The sun turned black in the middle of the battle. We could see it over us or should have thought we had been fighting till evening. Then we got into the camp, and there was a great deal of smoke and firing. Afterwards, the sun came out bright again. The sheer weight of numbers of the Zulu forced the issue. The redcoats were simply unable to deal with so many enemy completely surrounding them. Those that had the opportunity to run did so toward the Buffalo River, all the while being pursued by warriors who, given their lighter load and stronger, leaner builds, were able to catch many of the fleeing mass, pouncing on them with their crimson-stained spears. The place at which the panicked fleeing men attempted to cross the river is now known as Fugitives' Drift. Both of the regimental colours of the 2nd Battalion of the 24th were lost. Lieutenant Melville had attempted to flee with the colours of the 1st Battalion on his horse, but he was caught at the river. Lieutenant Coghill came to his aid, but both men were killed. Zulu accounts tell that of the final remnants of defenders had formed a rally square as the spear tips closed in for the final coup de grace. Not a single survivor from this last stand was left alive. Not long after 1500, the battle was over, and the Zulu were victorious. Aftermath. The battle had been a complete annihilation of the British force. Of the just over 1,800 men fielded, around 1,300 had been killed, making it the worst ever colonial defeat for Britain. Indeed, more British officers had fallen in this battle than at Waterloo. Chelmsford's detachment were not able to return in time, witnessing the final actions through telescopes with heavy hearts, knowing that there was nothing that they could do, and they had been completely outdone by an enemy that they had held in such low regard, a feeling that must have stung them deeply. The Zulu had suffered very heavily for their victory, however, with around 3,000 killed and a further 2,000 wounded. This proved just how effective firearms were, even if they were only single shot. A third of the engaged Zulus had fallen to them. As they picked over the dead, the Zulu cut open the abdomens of the corpses that littered the field. This act was seen as one of barbarism in Britain, but was in line with Zulu spiritual beliefs that doing so would allow the soul to exit the body. To not do so was thought to have condemned themselves to a slow and painful death with a swollen belly. You can well imagine that there would have been hardly a single blade of grass not flecked with blood for yards and yards around. The 4,000 to 5,000 men held in reserve for the battle, annoyed at having missed out on the glory of their victory, decided to break off and make their way toward the Natal border and attack the mission station at Rorke's Drift. But that is a story for another day. Legacy. They say that history is written by the winners, and this is why French history books are completely blank. But this also means that the Battle of Isandlwana is often overshadowed by the more famous and victorious Rorke's Drift. The two battles occurring so close together that the British public back home, wanting to completely forget about the catastrophic defeat, meant that the image of the brave British army achieving victory against the odds at Rorke's Drift was endlessly repeated by the newspapers of the time. The Battle of Isandlwana was slightly erroneously immortalised in the 1979 film Zulu Dawn, starring Burt Lancaster, which acts as a prequel to the 1964 film Zulu, which tells of Rorke's Drift, and served as the springboard for the career of a young Michael Caine. And not a lot of people know that. In the end, as far as one can argue the political points about whether they should have been there in the first place, the battle was lost due to poor decisions, along with hubris and arrogance, of Lord Chelmsford, who no doubt thought that his men were more than a match for a few blacks with spears. He would come to deeply rue that mindset. Had Chelmsford taken Gatling guns with him, the battle would have almost certainly have been a different outcome, given the sheer number of casualties the Zulus suffered just with rifle fire alone. This was proven later at the battles of Gingindlovu and Ulundi, where the Gatlings had proven devastating and led to a resounding victory in each engagement. But, despite the eventual defeat of the Zulu kingdom, they would still retain all of their lands, and the British withdrew pretty much straight away, leaving one to wonder why the hell they had even bothered. The simple answer, of course, lies in the fact that the British were far more content to keep the Boers happy and fight a native tribe. That way, the diamonds would keep flowing. On the flip side, the Zulu missed an opportunity to completely wipe out Chelmsford's column by not also going after the scouting party, which was far more vulnerable than the main encampment, that would have rendered them a pushover by comparison. They had not taken much ammunition or rations, so they could have even just been surrounded and allowed to have starved. However, given that the Zulus had lost around a quarter of their number, it is understandable that they chose not to pursue the rest of the British force. Had they done so, it is likely that the British could have sued for peace, and of course, once London found out, there would have been severe repercussions for this unsanctioned unilateral action. Indeed, Lord Chelmsford, despite his overall victory in the campaign, would be forced to resign in shame, and never held another field command. Both Lieutenants Melville and Coghill were posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for their efforts to preserve the 1st Battalion's colours, but this decision was heavily criticised by Sir Garnet Wolseley, who replaced Lord Chelmsford. He said, "I don't like the idea of officers escaping on horseback while their men on foot are being killed." Despite the attempt at appeasing the Boers by waging war against the Zulu, the annexation of their lands was unforgivable, and so, the following year, in 1880, the First Anglo-Boer War would begin. The terrible defeat at the Battle of Isandlwana serves as a stark lesson to never underestimate your enemy, and never believe that victory is certain. However, it is a lesson that very few commanders have learned in the years since. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. Drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts. What would you have done differently? All your engagement makes these videos reach more and more people, so I highly appreciate all of your help in that. Check out my back catalogue to find more great videos just like this one. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon, link in the description, or via the Super Thanks button if you wish to give a one-off donation. Or you can check out the DID merch store and pick yourself up some sweet swag. A big thank you to all my patrons. You've no idea how much I appreciate your contributions and the faith that you place in me. And if you can't get enough of my sweet smooth style, then check out my alternate channel DID Reads, where I post renditions of poems, famous speeches, etc. I'm also thinking of doing another spin-off channel to show off my musical side. What do you guys think? It would not interrupt the flow of this channel, of course. It's just something extra for a bit of fun. Again, let me know in the comments. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.